Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
My new book, Diary of a Psychosis, is out. It's the most lively, devastating baseball bat to the throat takedown of what the public health establishment did in 2020 and beyond that you can imagine. It's my first book in 9 years, and you're going to love it. Check it out at diaryofcovid.com. And if you've already bought it, make sure also to visit diaryofcovid.com so you can claim your free bonuses, including my free companion volume, Collateral Damage, a collection of stories from real people who suffered under the restrictions. They weren't allowed to tell their stories at the time, but every one of them told me, we just want to be heard. Check it all out at diaryofcovid.com. Hello, everybody. Tom Woods here, episode 2449, if you can believe that. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired. He's now CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, which we'll talk about at the end. You can visit it at ourcountryourchoice.com. And Colonel Macgregor, first of all, welcome to the program.
Happy to be with you.
I want to ask you, I've got a bunch of questions that I solicited from my listening audience, and they're delighted to know that you're here. I recall ever since the George W. Bush administration, I was in Poland on a little speaking tour, and I was watching like the one English language television network in my hotel room, and it was, I think, December maybe of 2007, and there had been some kind of intelligence report that had just come out saying that everybody had exaggerated Iran's nuclear intentions and where it was in the process of building a nuclear weapon. And this seemed to take the wind out of the sails of the people who were even at that time calling for war with Iran. Do you think there is a genuine prospect of anything other than skirmishes with Iran?
Not at the moment, but I would say that if you go back to 2001, the Iranians poured into the streets. 1 million of them demonstrated on the night after 9/11, holding candles to memorialize our losses on 9/11. And the Iranians treated 9/11 as an opportunity for some measure of reconciliation and cooperation with us. Incidentally, so did the Russians. The Russians actually created and established a memorial to us that you can find. The bottom line is that everything failed when the neocon, I think his name is Frum, who wrote George Bush's speech for him, described the axis of evil. And in Berlin in particular, I had a lot of friends over there, Americans and Germans who were journalists. When they listened to the axis of evil and included Iran and so forth, everybody just said, oh my God, what a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
I think this Iranian obsession in the United States is entirely a function of Israel. And the Israelis have, obsessed over Iran for a very long time. When I was over there in 2020, and on my previous visits, I tried to explore the possibility of some sort of come to Jesus moment between Israel and Iran. And many of the Israelis privately admitted that, there really ought to be, because Israel, the United States, and Iran all have much more in common than they appreciate. Iran should not be our opponent or their opponent. But there was ultimately no willingness whatsoever in the leadership of Israel to even contemplate it. And so I think you have to understand, when you look at the American media and the financial sector and the power of the Israel lobby, its agents in the United States, the American people have been systematically brainwashed into believing this nonsense that Iran is evil incarnate and responsible for everything that's bad in the region. Everybody forgets that after Trump was elected and he went after ISIS, that the Iranians, in particular the Shiite militias that had been equipped and trained by the Iranians in Iraq and Syria, all went after ISIS with a vengeance. The Russians, of course, chimed in and bombed the living daylights out of the ISIS chapters all over Syria and Iraq. All of that seems to have been either ignored or forgotten. And as soon as, they got Iran back on the agenda for destruction. And I think what Israel wants is for us to destroy Iran. And right now, given the level of power and influence that Mr. Netanyahu has in Washington, I think there's a very high probability that they may get what they want. Now, that's not to say that we can attack with impunity, we won't take any losses, or that Iran will go down. Things have changed a lot. Iran is much more sophisticated now, much better armed. It has friends and allies that will help it. So obviously I'm somebody that thinks the idea of attacking Iran is a very dumb one and unnecessary. But that's not the conventional wisdom in Washington or in the media.
And unfortunately, it is astonishing, although I think the number declines every day, how many Americans still watch these programs and believe what they're seeing. But as I say, I do think that that number is going down. And the one bright sign among the younger folks, and I never thought I would sound like an old fogey like this. The young people are full of crazy ideas. But one good idea is they do seem to be unconvinced of the unique benefits that allegedly accrue to the U.S. from the so-called special relationship with Israel. It seems to me it just caused a whole lot of headaches, and that's obvious to me. And I say that not as somebody who, you know all the names you get called if you say that, but I can't see what other conclusions somebody could draw.
Well, I've always strongly supported the Israelis simply because I think the Israeli state deserved to exist. I think 6 million people died and made a down payment on that state. So I have always been willing to support them and advocate for them, but I have never seen anything like this. And this has been a sea change for me in my views of Israel, because I knew there were many, many Israelis who wanted desperately to rid Israel of its Arabs, that they were an irritant and a danger and they should all be moved. I never heard anybody threaten them with extermination, mass murder. So at this point, it's very difficult for me to understand why President Biden doesn't pick up the phone and simply call and say, look, either you stop what you're doing in Gaza immediately or we will withdraw our support. Now, I do understand why that hasn't happened, because Mr. Netanyahu controls Washington. He's far more influential and powerful than Mr. Biden. Biden's almost an afterthought right now on the Hill compared with Netanyahu.
We read these headlines, though, about Biden and other presidents wringing their hands over Israel, over one thing or another, that they're allegedly so frustrated that they can't get the Israelis to see their point of view. But as you say, it wouldn't take a lot. I mean, the U.S. is in a very significant position here. It wouldn't take a lot if you really wanted to impose your view.
President Nixon supported the Israelis, but he also reined them in. He refused to let them cross into Egypt and create havoc and disaster in Cairo. And this came at the end, if you will, of the 73 war. The Israelis grossly underestimated the Egyptians. The Egyptians crossed, set up a brilliant defense. The Israelis had a lot of trouble. They took a lot of casualties. It's actually in some ways reminiscent of what we saw on 7 October. The Israelis were surprised, or at least that appears to be the case. Now, in retrospect, there was plenty of evidence that the Egyptians were going to cross the canal and do what they did, but people chose not to see it. That may well have been the case on 7 October. But the bottom line is, however justified Israeli strikes against Hamas may be, and I think they were after 7 October, there's no question. This business of engaging in ethnic cleansing and doing so on the American dollar and with American unconditional support is simply unacceptable. Now, most Americans aren't engaged. I don't know what you think, Tom, but I don't think most Americans are paying a great deal of attention. And historically, we have seldom paid attention to what happens overseas.
Well, I think that's got to be a good chunk of the explanation. I mean, when we look at how the war on terror was conducted for 20 plus years, and it seems like what it destabilized a whole bunch of places, took bad regimes, replaced them with worse ones. You would think somebody would complain about that after a while. You spent my money on what? But I think most of them don't pay attention.
Well, you have to look, too, at something else. Look at the driving forces behind our interventions in the Balkans, our subsequent intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they're very much the same people that are currently running your government today, driving the foreign policy. They're all ideologically aligned. They're all part of the same neoconservative group, if you will, that seems to want perpetual war. And part of it has always been in the Middle East, certainly to make the Middle East safer for Israel. But it's clear that our intervention in Iraq actually made things much worse for Israel, made the region far more dangerous to Israel than it was before we went in. So it was an immense failure. I don't see that what we're doing now is going to help Israel or guarantee its future existence. On the contrary, I worry that the conditions in the region are so dangerous. There is an explosive content to everything that's being said and done. Egypt, for instance, in 1973 had a little over 40 million people. Today, 100 million. In Egypt in 1973, the literacy rate was perhaps 40%. Today, it's up in the 80s. There are educated, trained, and capable people in all of these countries, especially in Iran and Turkey. Everyone in the region is enraged by what the Israelis are doing. And understandably, if you're living in Jordan or Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, you look at what's happening and say, well, what's coming for us? Is this not going to be happening to us unless we step up and do something? In the meantime, we are signaling unconditional support for whatever the Israelis want to do. And the world is shocked because historically, Eisenhower, Nixon both reined in the Israelis. Even LBJ exerted influence in the 67 word, to back off from some of the more extreme measures that might have been implemented in the aftermath of the collapse of the Arab states. So it's a bad situation for us. It's not good for Israel, and I worry that they may not survive this.
Wow. Well, meanwhile, in terms of what's going on in the Red Sea, the perpetrators there say they're not going to stop until the U.S. stops supporting Israel in Gaza. So that seems like it puts Biden in a tough spot. Maybe I'm sure you saw the clip from last week when a reporter asked him how that was going, the strikes in Yemen. He said, "Is that working?" He said, "Well, if by working, do you mean is it stopping the Houthis? No. Are we going to continue doing it? Yes."
Sure.
That's like foreign policy in a nutshell.
Well, that's the way we have done business probably over the last 60 years. If you go back over our history, we have a habit of bullying and sanctioning, then ultimately bombing anybody that didn't agree with us. What worked in Vietnam? Bombing never worked over there. Every time we set out to do something, we said we were signaling Hanoi that they needed to change their behavior. I always thought that was fanciful. We were going to bomb somebody because that's a message to them that their behavior is unacceptable to us. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but that's exactly what Averell Harriman and Lyndon Johnson and McNamara believed. And they continued this without any effect. In fact, every time they were bombed, the North Vietnamese adjusted, adapted, and they improved their performance. Things got worse for us. I think you can make the same argument during the Serbian or the Kosovo air campaign when we were trying to bomb the Serbs. The Serbs did not leave because of the air campaign. They left Kosovo because Stroh Talbot went to Moscow and bribed the Russians into pulling their support for the Serbs. Because the Serbs had been told by the Russians initially, we'll give you whatever you need to survive. We'll get you through the winter. We'll ship you oil so that you can heat everybody. We'll keep the electricity running. Then suddenly the Russians were bribed by us. We don't know the details, but they were bribed with a lot of money that I suspect we never paid them and other favors. And so they said, okay, sorry, Milosevic, we can't keep this up any longer because we have our own problems and we need American help. And so Milosevic said, well, if we don't have any oil for the winter, we can't heat people's homes, we can't keep factories running, power stations operating, we're going to have, 1 million dead Serbs. And so he said, that's it. We're going to have to throw in the towel. And so what was then called the Yugoslav army pulled out. We did remarkably little damage to them. That was what was astonishing. The numbers that were published publicly at the time were utterly false. They were just lies to try and conceal the fact that we couldn't hit much from the air. We never really degraded their air defenses below 83%. So they were able to do a brilliant job against us, but nobody admitted that. We declared victory, created the illusion we'd been successful. And if you go and look at all the bombings and the things that we did in Iraq and elsewhere, when you get to 1991, you look at the bombing campaign, which really destroyed the whole country. That didn't induce the Iraqi military to leave. The only way we got them out of Kuwait was for the ground force to attack and drive them out. Then, of course, we missed our opportunities to change the strategic landscape, but that's another story. The point is, bombing people doesn't make much difference. It's a mistake. Things get worse. Wars widen. So I don't know what Biden's got in his mind. I don't know whether or not Iran is on the target list, but I don't think it matters. We're going to start bombing, and we will keep this up on the assumption that somehow or another this is going to induce change. And I think what it will do is widen the war and ultimately present Israel with a much wider regional war than it has now. Not only will it drag Iran in, I think eventually the Turks will also be dragged in. Because even though these various actors in the region don't agree with each other on many things, they can all agree on one thing. They've had it with Israel, and they've had it with us. I mean, look, the Saudis just joined BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China. So has Iran. They've joined. This new entity is going to march in the direction of gold-backed currency. All of that is designed to get out from under us, out from under our financial system, which we use to bully people. So I see nothing good happening. The smart thing for Biden to do is what you said earlier, pick up the phone, call and say, look, either this stops or we withdraw our support. Put an end to this before this consumes the region. He's not going to do it.
Yeah. Let's thank our sponsor, Federated Computer. I know my listeners sometimes better than they know themselves. And I know you care about data privacy, and you're not particularly thrilled with the way big tech has been acting. Well, then maybe we ought to think about not using their free tools anymore. Oh, but they're free, you say. Yeah, well, so is the gruel you get in prison. The tools are free because they're harvesting your data, they're manipulating you, and that doesn't have to be. Federated Computer offers a full replacement for Google, Microsoft Office 365, Slack, Zoom, and more for people who care about privacy and not being treated like cattle. Everything is encrypted end-to-end and fully backed up daily. We're talking private email, file storage, team chat, WordPress hosting, CRM, help desk, email marketing tools, and more, all bundled up into one easy monthly subscription. You get unlimited users without your price going up and fantastic customer support from actual people, not bots. Their solutions are powered by open source software so you can take your data wherever you like, whenever you like. Visit federated.computer/woods today for your free 30-day trial. So how about that? A company that thinks its job is to, provide you with services instead of spying on you or shutting you up or manipulating you. Well, take your first step towards digital freedom. Visit www.federated.computer/woods today for your free 30-day trial. Well, let's shift gears because I want to ask you about a video clip I saw of Trump just within the past couple of days. And he was talking about Ukraine. He was out in Nevada, and he said that the important thing is to get the European countries to match what the U.S. is paying. And I thought that was an odd thing to emphasize. I mean, maybe in the abstract, there's some justice to that, but that seems quite beside the point. So he doesn't sound like somebody saying, well, I'm not going to let this continue any further. It's more this irrelevant question of, are the Europeans paying enough? Did you happen to hear that? What does that point to, do you think, in terms of Trump's outlook on this?
Well, first, as people know, I have a great deal of affection for President Trump on a personal level. I liked him very much, and I thought that his basic instincts were good. But the problem he has today is the problem he had when he was in office, and that is he surrounds himself with very bad people who give him extraordinarily bad advice. NATO is dead. It's been dead man walking for a while now. It's a total zombie. It's not going to survive what's happened in Ukraine. Russia presents no threat to Europe. Russia doesn't want to attack Europe. Russia acted as it did in eastern Ukraine because we goaded them into it. They had asked us for 25 years, please don't move NATO's border closer to our border. And we went ahead and did it, and they tolerated it until finally we moved into Ukraine. And that became an existential threat to Russia. Now, why? Is it because Americans wanted to threaten Russians? No. It's because the people in Washington want to threaten Russia. And the same people that are pushing war in the Middle East, that push war in the Balkans, are trying to keep this sick, demented campaign going in Ukraine, which is only killing more Ukrainians and doing more damage to Europe. What's the outcome of the war? The outcome of the war is that we've destroyed Europe's economy. The Germans are being deindustrialized. Here's the greatest scientific industrial power, or at least one of the three greatest in the history of the world, Germany, that is being deindustrialized as a result of cutting off cheap energy, natural gas, and other things from Russia. The Russians didn't do it. We did it. We cut them off. And so now Germany is in real trouble, which means that the European Union is on the ropes. Germany is the economic bulwark of Europe. You kill off Germany's economic strength, power, and productivity. What do you do to the rest of Europe? You essentially send it into a tailspin. You impoverish it. And that's what's happened in Europe. The Europeans are in terrible shape. And they're beginning to figure this out, but their leaders are carbon copies of what we have in Washington, D.C. They're all part of the globalist neocon community. And Russia was an outlier. Russia would not submit to us. Russia would not be bullied by our financial system. And Russia said enough's enough and went into eastern Ukraine, discovered that it was even worse than they anticipated. But they knew that if they didn't go in then, eventually missiles would show up from the United States and eastern Ukraine with which we could threaten Russia. It's insane. There's no reason for it. But right now, we're trying to compensate for this dramatic strategic failure in Ukraine by insisting that all of their leaders and ours lie about Russia and say Russia is this great threat. It isn't. It's not at all. What the Russians want to do is business with everybody in Europe. They'd like to do business with us. They don't want to occupy the place. Can you imagine the nightmare that would ensue if the Russians went into Western Europe? All these miserable economies, miserable societies, that the societies are fighting amongst themselves because they've got millions of migrants they don't want in their country. Their economies are failing and they can't afford all that they need to in order to preserve and protect and shelter their own populations. Forget it. The Russians aren't in the slightest bit interested in fighting in Western Europe. We are a danger right now to Europe and the world. We are the ones that want to put nuclear weapons, for God's sakes, in Great Britain again. Britain needs our nuclear weapons like they need an extra hole bored in their heads. This sort of thing needs to stop. It's wrong. It's unnecessary. We need to get off this bandwagon. And if we can intervene soon and put an end to what's happening in Gaza, I think we can arrest the drift, which is rapidly becoming a stampede to regional war. But I don't see that happening. And I think because of all of the neocons and globalists on the Hill and the people that dominate the federal bureaucracy, we'll get a major war. And we're completely unprepared for it. So are the Europeans. They don't have any war stocks left. Ours are severely reduced. We don't have enough missiles to sustain ourselves for a month, maybe not even 2 weeks, of all different types and kinds, air defense or strike missiles. This is crazy. We should not be involved in this. But back to your earlier observation, are the Americans even involved? See, Americans think that war is something that happens on someone else's soil. You know, for years, oh, well, that's Vietnam. Oh, well, that's Iraq. Oh, well, that's Afghanistan. They watch people blown to smithereens on the screen, and about a third of the American population says, yay, we're powerful. Look at us. We're great. They don't give a damn about what happened underneath the explosion. Now, some people do, but most don't. They just turn the channel and watch football, have another beer. That's where we are. Now, this is not going to happen this time. If we become embroiled in a war in the Middle East that involves Iran and other states, as I pointed out, and it will, you're going to see terror acts here in the United States. You've even had the director of the FBI, whom I don't think very highly of, because I think he's more concerned about harming Americans than he is anything else. But, you know, he did point out we've got a problem. 9 million people have poured into this country. We don't know who's here. Hezbollah has a huge chapter, if you will, in Mexico. So does ISIS. How many of these people are here? What could they do? What could happen to our power grid? What about our nuclear power plants? What about our military installations? What about our population? I mean, there are all sorts of terrible things that could happen. Nobody seems to be thinking about that in Washington, D.C. All they can think about is, let's get this war with Iran started. Maybe they think it's 1991 and that we are the preeminent military power in the world. We aren't. We just demonstrated that conclusively in Ukraine. Our equipment has not performed well. Our technology has not performed well. And our advice from all of our wonderful generals who've delivered nothing but defeat for 20 plus years was terrible.
I understand, of course, the U.S. has had a bellicose posture toward Russia for quite some time, but I've always been curious about, well, what do the Europeans think? And when I look at, you mentioned NATO as a dead man walking, but it has been expanding in terms of members, potentially Sweden now, Finland, and the justification for it is that the Russian bear is coming and you have to be secure against it. So do you think the Europeans really do believe that the propaganda?
Many do. In fact, in many cases, the Europeans are even more slavishly devoted to inhaling the lies and fiction than we are. You would think at this point, particularly after the Trump administration and the events of 2020 and the elections and so forth, that Americans would question a great deal that comes out of Washington and comes out of New York City, which is the hub for all the news. But surprisingly, many don't. Now, you and I also know something else. If people under the age of 50 don't watch Fox or almost any other cable news station. They get their news from alternative media. But young people aren't terribly engaged in any of this. Most of the younger folks are worried about, how do I make a living? Where am I going from here? And they're not paying attention. But they don't believe everything that's coming out. In Europe, it's a little different. There, particularly in Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Austria, Finland, people are sort of mindless robots. They think, well, on the television it said X, the news said this, the government says this, and you look at them and say, well, are you completely stupid? Don't you realize these people are lying to you? I mean, especially in Germany. You know, I get into these arguments with my German friends. I say, what's wrong with you? These people are not telling you the truth about Ukraine. They're not telling you the truth about the war. I've been saying this for 2 years. When this whole thing started, I said, Ukraine has no more chance of winning than Mexico would have winning a war with us. So wake up. And they look at me and said, well, the media and the government. I said, what's wrong with you? Have you learned nothing from history? Stop listening and think.
I want to know because we hear that, especially after October 7th, when suddenly the foreign policy establishment turned its attention to the Middle East, and we began to hear, indications that maybe we should moderate our expectations in Ukraine. Is the U.S. in fact in some way winding down its intervention or its involvement?
Well, inevitably. What did we do at the end of the Vietnam period? We just walked away. When things don't go our way, we pack up and leave. For how long did people insist that we were turning the corner in Afghanistan? How many times did we kill the insurgency in Iraq before we finally left in the middle of the night? I mean, the first time we thought about leaving, we found out that everybody that we were working with in Iraq was ratting us out. In other words, we'd be shot to pieces. So when we finally left Iraq back in 2011, we didn't tell anybody. We went out in the middle of the night. That's a great victory, isn't it? But no one ever bothers to go back and tell the truth. Because again, these are things that happen overseas. Americans have a bad habit of dismissing what happens beyond their borders as, okay, that's fine. It's not a big deal. We move on from here. I mean, how many strategic failures do you have to have before someone wakes up and says enough? And every year we have a bigger defense budget and a bigger budget for the intelligence organizations and special ops. You're spending over $1 trillion a year now. And roughly $1 trillion is what we pay to service the national sovereign debt. I mean, good Lord, this is insane. And everybody says, that's not a problem. We'll print more money. Well, you can print until you can't. And we're rapidly approaching that point, as I think people will find out the hard way this spring. But for the moment, everyone says, oh, drink up, be merry, everything's fine.
I know that I've noticed that a lot of people who, let's say, describe themselves as America first, they'll say that a lot of the alleged threats to the U.S. are overblown, and a lot of the interventions are unjustified. But they change their tune when it comes to China. They say China's a real threat. So, what do you think the real truth of the matter is? In what sense is China a threat to the U.S. or otherwise?
Well, I've never bought that argument ever. But if you look at China today, which is in very serious economic crisis, its shadow banking system has finally been exposed. The corruption has just engulfed everyone in China. That's why Xi spends all of his time rounding up generals and admirals in the army and the navy and imprisoning them. That's why he's imprisoning all sorts of so-called corporate leaders. China's a mess. A lot of the people that are now pouring into our country are single young men from China. Well, large numbers of them were wanted by the authorities for criminal behavior inside China. Not criminal behavior in the violent sense, but white-collar crime, embezzling, stealing, cheating on a whole range of topics. China has always had the problem of being too large, too big to govern. They can't barely manage themselves. The other thing is that the Chinese historically are not a great military power. Military power and the military profession are not really held in high esteem. What they want is a force that can protect them. They think they deserve that. But as far as invading somebody else's country, no. They tried that against the Vietnamese after the Vietnam War, and what happened to them? The Vietnamese crushed them. The Japanese, the Mongols, the Tartars, all of these people historically and Europeans have crushed China mercilessly. There's no threat from China. If we leave China alone, there are enough other actors in the region that the Chinese are not going to put themselves at risk. Japan is an enormously powerful state that never gets attention in the United States. The Japanese armed forces are superb. I would argue better than our own. So, the bottom line is, no, there is no threat from China. However, if you are in Asia and you ask the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the people that border China what the threat from China is, they'll say it's Chinese. If you let Chinese into your country, they come in, they colonize you, they take over your business sector, and then they bring in women and they peddle their women to the locals, and suddenly within a generation, you're no longer Vietnamese, Japanese, or Korean, you're just Chinese. In other words, they fear the population overwhelming them in the region. So you look at the border between North Korea and China, the Chinese want to keep the North Koreans out, but the North Koreans don't want anything to do with the Chinese. They're afraid that if the Chinese come into their country again, as they did during the Korean War, they'll never leave. They'll have millions of Chinese and they will cease to exist. The Manchus were a Mongol Turkic people in Manchuria. They cease to exist because they have, quote unquote, been Sinified. This is not a new phenomenon. This is how China has expanded. You move in and your population overwhelms the indigenous people, destroys their ethnicity, destroys their culture, their identity. That's the danger that people in Asia fear. They don't fear the economic danger. They want to be part of the Chinese market. They want to do business with them. They certainly don't fear the Chinese military.
Let's thank our sponsor, Blinkist. I am genuinely super proud to have sponsors of the quality of Blinkist. We are dealing with information overload in our day and age, and a great way to cope with it is with the Blinkist app. With the Blinkist app, you can absorb an enormous amount of information. You can almost sound like Scott Horton, and you can absorb it in 27 different nonfiction categories. So we're talking history, philosophy, parenting, career, technology, religion, on and on. Blinkist condenses each book into 15-minute summaries you can read or listen to. So that means if you have a half-hour commute each way, you can absorb the equivalent of 4 books. You think that might make you a more impressive person? And as I've said before, among the thousands and thousands of titles across all these categories at Blinkist, you'll even find libertarian classics by people like Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman, and even a book by all Woods here. Well, right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your 7-day free trial and get 25% off a premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 25% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. And now for a limited time, you can even use Blinkist Connect to share your premium account. You'll get 2 premium subscriptions for the price of 1. You made brief reference to Vietnam, and that reminded me, I suppose you know David Stockman?
Yes.
Okay. So David Stockman is an interesting guy because he agrees with you on foreign policy, it seems to me, almost completely, if not completely. And I asked him, well, how did you feel about the Cold War at the time? And he was actually must have been only a handful of non-interventionists back then. Now, when I was in high school, at age 16, on my own, over the summer, with no one prompting me to do it, I read Richard Nixon's book, No More Vietnams. And it convinced me that Vietnam was necessary and just. And I just followed that. I was very much an interventionist for several years. I was a young kid. And then after I observed the 1990s and then certainly the War on Terror, then retrospectively, I look back at the way I thought about these other conflicts and I began to think, maybe that was also unwise. So in other words, the bad experiences we've had in more recent foreign policy made me rethink my opinions about earlier ones. Have you had that experience, and where did you stand during the Cold War?
Well, first of all, a lot of the Cold War I spent standing in uniform, so I was never asked for my opinion. But before I went into the military, and that was 1971, when I went to VMI, the view in my household was very divided. I remember that my mother took the position that we had to support the troops in Vietnam. My maternal grandfather, who had been in the First World War and hated Woodrow Wilson and concluded early on that war had been a total mistake, turned to her and would say repeatedly, well, if you want to support the troops, get them the hell out of Vietnam and bring them home. He was right. We didn't need to fight in Vietnam. And you'll listen to people who will argue until their death, oh, if we hadn't done that, all of Southeast Asia would be communist. Doubtful. I don't think so. There was this assumption about communism that it was monolithic. It never was. Stalin's famous comment on the Chinese after spending time with Mao is, these people are red onions. They're red on the outside and white on the inside. In other words, they act like communists, but they're really a bunch of capitalists. Of course, he was right. The Cold War is something that was very different because it began in a very different environment. Everybody runs around and talks about our great victory in the Second World War. But truthfully, by the 1950s, people realized we had not won the Second World War. We advanced to the middle of Europe and stopped. And Europe was divided. Half of Europe and all of Asia had been conquered by Soviet communism. And so people said, my God, what did we do? You could go back and read Kennan, and he talks about the fact that we moved so slowly out of France and into Germany, and we took horrendous casualties while we were moving, by the way, so it didn't save us in terms of American lives very much. Then by the time we arrived, the game had been called. The Soviets occupied Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Warsaw. Remember, Churchill and FDR promised the Poles, pie in the sky. You will be a free, independent, and democratic state. That's why we're fighting this war. Bloop, didn't work. It was a complete failure. So the aftermath of World War II was a little different from what everybody thinks today. There were lots of people who said, gee, this hadn't worked out well. It could have been a lot different, could have been handled better. The aftermath of World War I was much more clear-cut. People all knew that we shouldn't have gotten into the war. We made a mess out of Europe. I urge people to do this. Warren Harding's inaugural speech is worth reading because he makes the argument for no more alliances, no more commitments to anyone, that America's future should not be hostage to another country's interests. We have no interest in becoming part of other people's wars. Well, until 1929 and the Depression struck, that was the attitude. The Depression changed everything. It suddenly propelled FDR into power, who was, by standards today, a neocon trying desperately to embroil us in war, worked tirelessly through the 30s to get us into war against the Germans, and refused to see the danger presented by Stalin. I mean, we could go on and on and on and talk about these things, but the point is, this is 2023. Have we had enough? How many Americans' lives have been sacrificed? How much treasure has been wasted? We were sitting down the other day and talking about the thousands of hospitals that could have been built with half of the 14 trillion lost during the last 20 plus years on these interventions. What kinds of things could we have done for our own country and our own population? People need to start asking those questions.
Yeah.
And they need to understand that we have one existential threat today. That emanates from the southern border. And someone who says it's not an invasion has lost their mind. We are being invaded, and our own government is helping it. 9 million have come in since Biden became president. But there are probably another 20 million illegals already in the country from the 1990s and during the period of the Bush and Obama administrations. This is a catastrophe for us. We can't absorb these people. And thanks to President Obama, who announced that there was no requirement for anyone to assimilate in order to be an American citizen, how many people are running around with American citizenship who are just here because it's a ticket of admission to the great consumption machine? What's happened to our national identity, our culture? Well, that's being erased. Well, finally, some people are standing up. They're standing up down in Texas, thanks to Governor Abbott. Maybe this is a turning point. Maybe finally the American people will stand up and say enough's enough. That's the real danger. And again, too many people inside this country with uncertain origins and uncertain interests. We don't know what that means for the future, but it doesn't mean much good. And somebody said to me the other day, well, you must be a racist. You don't like Mexicans? I said, no, of course not. There's nothing to do with it. He said, well, then what do you think we should take from Mexico? I said, I'll be happy to bring in every Mexican who speaks English and has a degree in applied mathematics, engineering, or science. This guy, well, that's not going to happen. I said, well, that's what we should demand now. We can be selective. We don't have to take everyone.
Why doesn't that guy ask the Mexican government why it's so stingy about allowing immigration? It's almost like there's a double standard.
Of course.
Incidentally, I want to make mention of two people everybody hates. You mentioned Warren Harding. He also has a fantastic speech when he accepted the Republican nomination for president. It's interesting, these presidential speeches that we're all supposed to read in school are all the terrible messianic ones that we should ignore. But Warren Harding actually gave great speeches that nobody likes. But the other thing I just want to say very quickly, one of my proudest moments on the Tom Woods Show was one of the times I had Pat Buchanan on. And Pat wrote some of the speeches for Nixon about Vietnam. So there's no way Tom Woods is not going to convince him that that was a mistake. But I came close. I came so close because I said, Pat, the cultural degradation that you deplore was accelerated by Vietnam because the anti-war movement and the counterculture bled into each other. It accelerated the very thing that you're worried about. Not to mention, we lost the war anyway, and it was not the end of the world. And think of where these resources might have gone otherwise. That's the way a conservative, I think, ought to think about foreign intervention and the rights and wrongs of it.
There's a great book by Corelli Barnett, and it's all about the decline of British power. And he explains what happened to Britain during World War II. And he points out that everyone, even when they were deploying to France to support the French in 1939, the preeminent concern for the cabinet and for the British people was the empire, not France. And they were concerned that whatever they sent to France should not come at the expense of securing the empire. And so you had hundreds of thousands of British soldiers and seamen and airmen all over the world, in Asia and in Europe, fighting to preserve the empire. And what happened? Britain bankrupted itself. They were absolutely broken as a result of the Second World War. And by 1947, the debt to GDP ratio was 240%. And suddenly India, the crown jewel of the British Empire was abandoned. The British didn't just leave, they ran out because they couldn't afford to stay. It was a fire sale on the empire. We are going to witness a fire sale on our empire. We're going to go through something just like that. I think it's this year. So does James Ricard's. There are many others that think that. Nassim Taleb has been warning about this sort of thing. And the people in Washington and New York City that are heavily invested in all these bad ideas and fraudulent schemes, the people that were involved in mortgage-backed securities and the housing market in 2007 and 8, they're all still with us. They should have all been allowed to go under. But instead of letting them go under, we bailed everybody out. Big mistake. They're still with us, and they're going to go down for this. And there's not going to be any bailout. The question is, when do Americans finally wake up? I hope it's not when everything is so dead in terms of our economic production and our economy and the financial system. I hope it happens earlier than that. But I'm afraid that Americans aren't going to pay much attention until they go to the store, and instead of a 25% increase in the price of meat, it's 100%. And then somebody will step back and say, God, how'd this happen?
Yeah.
Well, it happened while you were asleep, bud.
Right.
You weren't paying attention.
We were trying to tell you. You are the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Can you take a minute to tell people about that?
Sure. By the way, Our Country, Our Choice is headquartered in Orlando, Florida. It's a brand new facility that we've established. And frankly, we started out expecting that we would make some progress, but in 4 months, we're over 100,000 members and we're picking up 1,500 to 2,000 every week. Now, why is this? Because Our Country, Our Choice wants to be a third force in American politics. We are not aligned with the Republicans and the Democrats. We are people who have said several things. Number one, we figured out that it doesn't matter who you vote for. You get the same bad policy outcomes. So you can chuck this Republican versus Democratic nonsense. And then secondly, we're tired that there is no law enforcement. Just yesterday, it was announced that all of the people that had committed terrible crimes in New York City, who are so-called migrants, along with some native New Yorkers that were inflicting violence and doing damage to property, they would all be released without bail. They weren't going to be held. In other words, they're not being held accountable. This is happening all over the country. We could spend hours talking about the attorneys general that George Soros helped to fund that have established themselves in these big cities. They're essentially legitimating criminality. We want to return to the rule of law. We want a place where police are not afraid to enforce the law for fear they may have to go to jail. We want the borders closed. We think immigration can be good, but right now it's very bad. We have millions and millions of people inside this country that we can't afford to keep. When the economy tanks and the financial system explodes, we're going to see just how bad it is. Because people are going to wake up and look at all of these individuals the government's trying to aid and support and say, wait a minute, they're not citizens. What are they doing in this country? And we go down from there. We're sick of the sexualization of children. We don't like the agenda, this sort of Marxist Trotskyite agenda that pretends that men can have babies and that switching out genitalia is no big deal. This sort of stuff is sick. It's demented. It's degenerate. It has to end. We want to stop these things. Now, that's not all, but those are the big items. And frankly, we'd like to see electoral integrity, but we've got 50 states. Each state has different regulations and rules, and there's no guarantee, depending upon who governs you, whether or not you're going to have a free and fair election. So, we are not stupid. We're not naive. We know this is a big problem. But if we can build this third way into a real movement, and bring millions of people in, we think that we can ultimately have an impact because we want to recruit new people. The biggest problem we have in Washington, Tom, is that every time they look for someone to appoint, they go back to the poison well. What's the poison well? The poison well consists of the Ivy League schools and the service academies. If you go to these places and appoint these people, you're getting wokeness on steroids. You're getting people who are completely out of touch with reality in the international system. People that believe that we have some sort of God-given right to interfere in everybody else's society to create some sort of replica of our own society when we think our problems at home are far more important. So, this is what Our Country, Our Choice is about. And it's going to take us time. We know it's not going to happen overnight, but we're very optimistic right now with the numbers of people who are jumping on board. And we want to see a lot of our members installed in the future in key positions in Washington.
Well, the website is ourcountryourchoice.com. So I'll link to that in the video description and also on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2449. Colonel Macgregor, I appreciate your time very much. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. God bless.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.